Peace, mercy, and blessings of God be upon you, and welcome to all our dear followers everywhere. The Greatest Secret channel, under the supervision and management of the writer and author Mr. Mohammad Salim Al-Kazimi, Al-Maqdisi, is pleased to welcome you to this renewed encounter and to announce the launch of the new and highly anticipated season of the legendary debate between the atheist and the Muslim. This season comes to unveil the most prominent intellectual issue of our time, which revolves around the dilemma of atheism in denying the unseen world.
From an audio article to the grand debate. This intellectual discourse began as an audio article in 3 international languages, Arabic, English, and German, authored by the channel's director, Mr. Mohammad Al-Kazimi. You can always access it via the link in the description box below this video on the Greatest Secret YouTube channel. Given the significant and remarkable interest this topic has garnered, and the exceptional engagement and numerous insightful comments and contributions we have received, especially from our German and English-speaking followers, the channel's management has decided to transform these discussions and scholarly responses into a visual and audio format. These responses have been structured as a legendary debate, spanning several episodes, totaling over 10 hours of philosophical and scientific research and analysis.
Why is it an exceptional debate? Contemporary and sensitive topics. The episodes address issues that touch upon the very essence of human existence and speak directly to the human mind in our present time. Comprehensive approach. This is a global debate that excludes no one, opening the doors of thought to every thoughtful seeker of truth on this planet.
Share your opinions with us. We hope you enjoy this engaging and intellectually stimulating program. We at the channel's management encourage anyone with a comment, viewpoint, or contribution to share it with us in the comments section. We are open to hearing your opinions and are fully prepared to discuss them politely, objectively, and with mutual respect. Be there, and we hope you enjoy the show.
The Muslim says, how did you get from energy is neither created nor destroyed in the system to energy has existed since time immemorial? The law of conservation of energy describes the behavior of energy within the physical time frame in which it applies, but it does not prove that this time frame extends infinitely into the past.
The atheist comments. The first law makes no mention of a time frame, nor is there any reason to assume one.
The Muslim replies, the fact that a law does not mention something does not prove its opposite. While the first law does not specify an explicit time frame, it also says nothing about eternity. Therefore, one cannot infer eternity simply from the law's silence on this subject. The crucial point is that the law describes a relationship between energy states when a physical description is applicable. The inference from energy is conserved to energy has always existed is an additional statement not explicitly contained in the law itself. Furthermore, the burden of proof lies with the one who claims eternity. I do not assume a limited time frame. Rather, I argue that the law of conservation of energy alone is insufficient to prove that the past continues without beginning. The law is logically compatible with an eternal universe, just as it is with a universe that has a beginning and in which energy is conserved after that beginning. Therefore, it cannot be used on its own to resolve the question. In other words, the absence of evidence for a beginning is not evidence for eternity, just as the absence of evidence for eternity is not evidence for a beginning. What I object to is the inference from the law of conservation of energy to the eternity of energy, since this inference does not follow logically from the premises. I can summarize the answer as follows. The law does not mention eternity. If its silence on the beginning does not prove the beginning, then its silence on eternity does not prove eternity either. What is needed is independent evidence that links the law of conservation of energy to the eternity of energy, not merely an assumption about it. The Muslim says, and there is no scientific consensus that the total energy of the universe is conserved in the same way as in local systems.
The atheist comments. Then please provide opposing viewpoints with sources that state that energy can be lost in the universe.
The Muslim replies, I never claimed that there is energy loss in the strict sense. Rather, the issue is the difficulty of defining the total energy of the universe in general relativity. You are changing the subject. I did not say that there is a scientific consensus that energy is lost or disappears in the universe. I said that there is no consensus that the total energy of the universe is conserved in the same way as energy in local systems. In fact, there are established views in cosmology and general relativity that the concept of the total energy of the universe is not universally and simply defined, and that energy conservation at the cosmic level is not as clear-cut as in local physics. For example, physicist Sean Carroll points out that energy in the expanding universe is not conserved in the usual global sense because space-time itself changes over time. Photons from distant galaxies also lose energy due to cosmic redshift, and there is no general consensus on the existence of a specific energy reservoir into which this energy can be returned. PreposterousUniverse.com. Similarly, several cosmology textbooks explain that while energy conservation is well documented locally, matter at cosmic scales and in the expanding universe is more complex. There is no general law that dictates the conservation of the total energy of the universe in the same way as in ordinary closed systems. Boreum Sciencepedia. Therefore, you are not required to provide an example of vanishing energy, but rather to show that the total energy of the universe is precisely, it is defined, and its conservation has been universally proven. This is the point of contention among experts. In short, I did not claim that energy disappears. I said that some cosmologists doubt whether the total energy of the universe can even be defined and conserved in the traditional sense. Therefore, the transition from local energy conservation to the eternity of the energy of the entire universe requires further proof. PreposterousUniverse.com. The Muslim says, therefore, the eternity of energy is not a direct scientific consequence of the first law of thermodynamics, but a philosophical hypothesis that requires independent proof.
The atheist comments. That only holds true if the universe were not a closed system and contained anything that was not a form of energy.
The Muslim replies, no, that does not follow logically from what you said. Even if we assume that the universe is a closed system and that everything in it consists of different forms of energy, this does not prove that energy is eternal. The fact that a system is closed simply means that it has no energy exchange with the outside world. Whether this system has always existed or only came into being at a certain point in time is a completely different question. Similarly, the fact that all components of the universe are forms of energy answers the question, what is the universe made of, but not the question, has this reality always existed, or did it only come into being later? You are still starting from the following assumptions. 1. The universe is a closed system. 2. Everything in it is energy or a form of energy. 3. Energy is conserved within the system. And from this you conclude. 4. Therefore, energy is eternal. But the fourth step does not follow logically from the first three premises. To achieve this, another premise must be added. Everything that is conserved in a closed system must be eternal. And this premise itself requires proof. Therefore, the eternity of energy remains an additional claim that goes beyond what the law of conservation of energy proves. The law describes the behavior of energy within an existing system, but it does not prove that the system or the energy had no beginning. I can summarize the answer as follows. The closed state of the system and the conservation of energy within it do not prove its eternity. The law describes the persistence of energy as long as the system exists. It does not prove that the system or the energy existed eternally. The Muslim says, why does energy exist at all and not? What explains the existence of this eternal energy, its properties, and its laws?
The atheist comments. If the Muslim not only asks but asserts his God as an explanation, then he must also show that this God exists and what, in turn, explains his existence, but this only postpones the problem of explanation by one step. Furthermore, the Muslim would have to show that and how exactly this God constitutes an explanation, from what, with what methods, and for what purpose did this God create energy, its properties, and laws.
The Muslim replies, there is a fundamental difference between the assumption that energy is an unexplained, primary reality and the assertion that there is a necessary being that explains the existence of other things. Here you are conflating two different questions, the question of proving God's existence and the question of whether the explanation of energy's existence is based on a primary reality. I have the question, why does energy exist? This is not presented as conclusive proof of God's existence, but rather to point out that considering energy as an eternal reality requiring explanation is in itself a philosophical position, not a scientific conclusion. Their claim that explaining energy through God delays explanation by one step is only true if God and energy share the same existential nature. However, classical theology does not postulate that God is merely another entity in the chain of being that, like physical entities, requires a cause. Traditional theological arguments do not begin with the principle everything has a cause, but rather with the principle that contingent, mutable, or dependent beings require explanation and ultimately culminate in a necessary being that depends on nothing else. Therefore, the question, what explains God's existence, is a separate question. This question can only be posed in the same way if it has first been established that God is a contingent, dependent, or composite being. It is like energy in the universe. Furthermore, your question, from what did God create energy, presupposes that creation must be a transformation of pre-existing matter, whereas in Islamic thought it means bringing forth, not transforming pre-existing matter. Therefore, the question of the matter from which energy was created is not inherent in the concept of creation itself. The purpose of creation is a matter independent of the origin of existence. One may disagree about the purpose, but this does not change the fundamental question. Is energy a primary self-contained reality, or do its existence and laws require a deeper explanation? Thus, before questioning the divine explanation, one must explain why energy and its laws are treated as absolute realities that require no explanation, rather than simply taking them for granted. The concise answer is, if one remains fixated on the idea of eternal, unexplained energy, it is fundamentally inadmissible to criticize someone who persists in the concept of necessary being. The real debate remains, which of the two hypotheses is better suited to explaining the existence of reality and its laws, instead of merely asserting that every explanation only shifts the question by one step. The Muslim says, rather, I ask, is there a sufficient reason that makes the existence of energy and its laws understandable, or are they simply fundamental truths that require no further explanation?
The atheist comments. Thank you for the clarification. So it is about causal explanation. The questions about causes are more than justified, but it must be remembered, we never reach an end that itself does not require a causal explanation. Simply assuming a God as the first cause is a completely arbitrary interruption of the open question.
The Muslim replies, the objection presupposes that every explanation must be a causal explanation of the same kind, and this is a point of considerable philosophical controversy. I agree that we should not arbitrarily break the chain of knowledge, but that is precisely what the proponents of first cause or necessary being do not intend. It is not a matter of asking about the cause of a cause of a cause and then suddenly arriving at God. Rather, the argument is that the chain of causal explanations for existing things is not self-explanatory, and therefore we must arrive at a different kind of explanatory basis, not an additional link in the same chain. In other words, the question is not, what cause preceded God, but does everything that exists require an explanation of the same kind? If the answer is yes, the chain will never end, and we will never arrive at a final explanation for anything. If the answer is no, then there must ultimately be a fundamental truth that derives from nothing else. Herein lies the real question. Why is it permissible to consider energy and its laws as fundamental truths that require no explanation, while the assumption of a necessary being as a fundamental truth is an arbitrary conclusion? In both cases, there is a conclusion. The difference lies in the fact that the theological perspective justifies this conclusion with the assertion that God exists necessarily and independently, while the naturalistic perspective remains at the level of energy, laws, or physical reality as the ultimate given. The debate, therefore, is not about who ends the question and who does not, because every philosophical perspective ultimately encounters something fundamental. Rather, it is about the question, what is better suited as the ultimate basis for explanation? Physical reality and its laws, or a necessary being that explains the existence of this reality? I can summarize the answer as follows. If the endpoint regarding God is arbitrary, why? Isn't the endpoint regarding energy and the laws of nature also arbitrary? The real point of contention is not the existence of an endpoint, but rather which endpoint possesses greater explanatory power. The Muslim says, but if we ask, why do the laws of nature and energy exist at all and not simply not? We are not asking about a physical mechanism in the universe, but about the foundation upon which the existence of these facts rests.
The atheist comments. As I said, if the question arbitrarily ends with the assertion of a God as the foundation, then that is not a solution, but merely a way of obscuring the question of what the foundation, the reason, or the explanation for this God might be. Oh. Especially since no explanation is given at all as to how exactly God proceeded in the alleged creation of, for example, natural laws or energy, and there is also not a single piece of evidence that this creation actually took place.
The Muslim replies. The objection conflates the proof of the validity of an explanation with the nature of the explanation itself. You jump from one question to another. Your question was, is the existence of energy and natural laws a primary, inexplicable fact, or is there a basis that explains their existence? Now you are demanding proof of the validity of a divine explanation. These are two different arguments. Even if we were to assume, for the sake of argument, that a divine explanation has not yet been proven, energy and natural laws would not automatically be explainable by that. The question remains, why do these facts exist at all? Furthermore, you describe adherence to God as arbitrary, yet at the same time you treat energy and natural laws as absolute givens. If simply clinging to a fundamental fact is arbitrary, then this objection also applies to your position. Your statement, there is no explanation for how creation occurred, presupposes that any explanation must be a description of a physical mechanism. However, the question does not concern a physical mechanism within the universe, but rather the very foundation upon which the existence of the universe itself rests. When a philosopher asks, why is there something rather than nothing? They are not seeking a description of some prior physical interaction of the universe, but rather an explanation for the fundamental existence of reality. Furthermore, our lack of knowledge about how the act of creation, if it occurred, came about does not preclude its occurrence. We usually distinguish between the question, is there an explanation, and the question, what detailed mechanism underlies this explanation? Therefore, the question remains unanswered, what makes energy and the laws of nature candidates for ultimate, self-contained truths, while any explanation that transcends them is rejected in principle? I can summarize the answer as follows. Even if a divine explanation is not proven, that doesn't make energy and the laws of nature explainable. The question remains, why do these truths exist at all? And if it is arbitrary to stop at God, what justifies not also considering energy and the laws of nature as arbitrary? The Muslim says, is it intellectually legitimate to ask for sufficient justification for the existence of things, or should we accept certain facts as irrefutable givens?
The atheist comments. It is always legitimate to ask questions, but then one shouldn't arbitrarily stop asking and be satisfied with a pseudo-answer, but rather admit that the chain of questions about causes is infinite.
The Muslim replies, this position leads either to the acceptance of a fundamental truth or to an endless chain of inferences. I agree with you that questions are always legitimate, but to say that the chain of questions about causes is endless is not an answer to the question. Rather, it is the adoption of a possible philosophical position. If every truth requires another truth to explain it, and that in turn requires yet another to explain it ad infinitum, then the question is, how do you explain the entire chain? Adding infinitely many links does not necessarily explain why the chain exists at all. Furthermore, your objection to an arbitrary termination procedure does not resolve the problem, since we are faced with three logical options and not a fourth. 1. Termination at a fundamental truth that requires no explanation. 2. An infinite chain of explanations. 3. Circular reasoning, i.e., something explains itself or within a closed loop. Therefore, the question is not termination or not. Rather, which option is the most reasonable and insightful? If one chooses an infinite chain of explanations, one must show how this chain explains the existence of reality, instead of endlessly postponing the explanation. If one rejects an infinite regress, one again needs a fundamental truth to which one can refer. The legitimate question, therefore, is not whether we reach a fundamental point, but rather its nature. Is it an eternal physical reality with its laws, or a deeper metaphysical truth that explains the existence of this reality? I can summarize the answer as follows. If the chain of explanations never ends, one has not explained anything, but merely endlessly postponed the explanation, delayed. However, if it ends with a fundamental truth, the question is not whether it exists at all, but what this fundamental truth is. The Muslim says, I am not claiming that the universe must have a temporal beginning. I am merely saying that denying a temporal beginning does not provide an explanation for the existence of the universe.
Atheists comment. That's understandable, but I'm still unclear on what exactly you mean by an explanation for existence.
The Muslim replies, the intended meaning of explaining existence is not merely to describe how the universe works, but rather to provide a sufficient reason for its existence, not for its non-existence. The goal of explaining existence is to explore what makes the existence of the universe philosophically comprehensible, not simply to describe its properties or its chronological history. Whether the universe had a temporal beginning or was eternal in the past, the question remains, why does this universe exist at all, and not nothing? In other words, denying a temporal beginning may answer the question, when did the universe come into being? But it does not answer the question, what explains its existence? The explanation I am referring to provides a sufficient basis or reason for the existence of reality itself, not the establishment of a point in time for its beginning. Therefore, the question of the eternity or non-eternity of the universe is logically separate from the question of explaining its existence. One can imagine an eternal universe and still ask, what makes the existence of this eternal universe possible in the first place? The Muslim says, the universe may be eternal, but the philosophical question remains. Is its eternity a self-evident primary truth, or does it require explanation? This is the crux of the debate.
Comment by the atheist. If you believe you have an explanation, what exactly does it explain, and how exactly? Let's say someone claims that a mythical figure spontaneously created everything out of nothing, as if by magic. How could this be an explanation without first explaining the existence of the mythical figure and the magical creation? Wouldn't one be left with a god of the gaps instead of simply admitting that one has no explanation?
The Muslim replies, the objection doesn't address the core question you're asking. Rather, it implies that any explanation must be of the same nature as the explanation of the universe. Here you are digressing and refusing a concrete answer. I haven't yet claimed that any particular explanation is correct. My first question is the existence of the universe a fundamental truth that requires no explanation, or does it require explanation? As for the objection that any explanation leads to a new question, and what explains the explainer, this doesn't prove the absence of an explanation. Rather, it raises the question of the nature of the ultimately possible explanation. Philosophy has long distinguished between beings that require external explanation and what might be an ultimate reality or existential necessity beyond which all explanation ceases. If it is claimed that the universe is this ultimate reality, this is a philosophical statement that must be defended. And if it is claimed that there is a cause that transcends the universe and constitutes ultimate reality, this claim also requires defense. However, it is unacceptable to assume that the first option is exempt from the burden of justification, while the second is categorically rejected as a gapless God. Moreover, the concept of a gapless God implies invoking God to fill a gap in our scientific knowledge. My question, however, is not about a scientific gap in the universe, but about the explanation for the existence of the universe itself. It is not a question of, we don't know how something happened, so God did it, but rather, is there any definitive explanation for existence at all, or is existence a primary reality? This is the crux of the debate, not merely the assertion that every explanation would raise another question. The Muslim says, this point is crucial to the discussion. You're trying to go from energy is eternal to therefore there is no need for a first cause or an ultimate basis.
Comment of the atheist. However, this is a significant philosophical leap that requires proof, not a conclusion that follows from eternity itself. If we assume that a. Our universe contains everything that exists. b. Everything that exists is represented as a form of energy. c. Energy is eternal, then d. The universe must also be eternal. b. And e. Therefore has and needs neither a first cause nor an ultimate foundation. Especially since, as always, the question would remain open, what would be the source of the ultimate cause, and the final and last, its foundation? To refrain from asking these questions of any link in the chain would be pure arbitrariness.
The Muslim replies, the problem lies not in the assumption of the eternity of the universe, but in the inference from eternity to explanatory power, since these are two logically distinct things. Furthermore, I see a confusion of two questions. First, are the universe or energy eternal? Second, does eternity itself eliminate the need for an explanation? I do not deny that your premises B, C could lead to conclusion D, that is, to an eternal universe. However, the inference from D to E is not a necessary logical inference. It is an additional philosophical assumption that requires independent proof. Eternity describes the duration of existence, while explanation refers to the cause or basis of existence. Even if we were to argue that energy is eternal, the philosophical question remains, why does this eternal energy exist at all, rather than nothing? Describing something as eternal does not automatically answer this question. It merely postpones the question of temporal beginning. Regarding your statement that the question is, what is the source of the ultimate cause? This question should be asked at every stage of the chain, and I agree that it is valid. The point of contention, however, is, can the chain culminate in a fundamental truth or a necessary reality that requires no external explanation or not? If you consider the universe or energy to be this fundamental truth, this is a legitimate philosophical position, but not a conclusion compelled by eternity alone. If you completely deny the possibility of a fundamental truth, you must explain how an explanation can be complete if everything always requires something else to explain it. Therefore, the core of the debate is not, is the universe eternal? But rather, is there an ultimate truth beyond which all explanation ceases? The eternity of the universe alone does not answer this question. The Muslim says, I can summarize the answer as follows. The closed state of the system and the conservation of energy within it do not prove its eternity. The statement describes the persistence of energy as long as the system exists. It does not prove that the system or the energy has existed eternally.
Comment by the atheist. This discussion doesn't even have to be centered on energy, because a similar, yet somewhat different question, which many theists also ask, would be, can nothing come from nothing, nihil ex nihilo? If this is answered in the negative, then everything that exists today, whether energy or not, must have always existed in some other form. Conversely, if something that exists today has not always existed in some other form, then it must have arisen from nothing. Do you believe in arising from nothing, or in divine creation from nothing?
The Muslim replies, the intervention presents a dichotomy that may not be logically sound and conflates philosophical nothingness with divine creation. I believe that the terms must be clarified before this dichotomy is constructed. I am not claiming that things arise from absolute nothingness without cause, but I also do not believe that the direct denial of this fact obliges us to claim that everything we see today has always existed in the same or even a previous material form. The real question is, what is meant by nothing, and what is meant by eternal existence? Furthermore, the assertion of divine creation does not necessarily mean that the universe arose from nothing. Rather, it means that the universe did not exist and only came into being through an efficient cause that transcends the universe itself. In this view, nothingness is neither cause nor mechanism, but merely the negation of the universe's existence prior to its creation. Likewise, rejecting the principle nothing arises from nothing does not prove that the universe, matter, or energy are eternal. It merely proves that pure nothingness is not a sufficient explanation for the existence of things. The question of whether reality is eternal or depends on a cause beyond itself is a separate question that requires further argumentation. Therefore, I do not believe that the possibilities of the eternity of matter or their origin from absolute nothingness is limited. There is a third, philosophically recognized possibility. The existence of the universe depends on a cause or an existential basis that is not part of the universe itself. The question thus remains open. Is material reality the ultimate truth, requiring no external explanation, or does the explanation for its existence lie in something beyond it? This is the crux of the true philosophical debate.